The collapse of society is no longer a distant warning whispered by pessimists on the fringe. It is happening right now in real time, faster than almost anyone predicted, and the pace is accelerating with every passing month. Global events are escalating at a speed that is leaving even the experts struggling to keep up. We are now witnessing wars erupting on multiple continents at the same time, while the very systems that hold modern civilization together, our food, our energy, our money, our climate, and our institutions, are buckling under pressures none of them were built to withstand. Supply chains that took decades to weave together are tearing apart in a matter of weeks. The cost of basic survival is climbing out of reach for billions of people. And beneath all of it, the planet itself is sending us signal after signal that the foundations of the world we have built are cracking. More than 50 years ago, a team of scientists at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology tried to warn us exactly about this moment. In 1972, in the best-selling book The Limits to Growth, those researchers argued that industrial civilization was on a collision course with reality, that a system obsessed with infinite economic growth on a finite planet was destined to overshoot and collapse if corporations and governments kept chasing endless expansion no matter the cost. Their computer model, called World 3, mapped out 12 possible scenarios for the future of humanity. Most of them pointed toward the same terrifying outcome, a point where natural resources would become so scarce that further economic growth would grind to a halt, and where the quality of life would fall sharply all over the planet. The most infamous of those scenarios, the one the researchers called business as usual, predicted that global economic growth would peak and then reverse somewhere around the 2040s, when most of the world's economies would face a massive meltdown alongside the global population, food availability, and natural resources. But here is the part that should make every one of us sit up and pay attention. In the years since that warning, independent analysts have gone back, taken the real-world data we have actually lived through, and compared it against those decades-old projections. The conclusion was chilling. Human society is tracking almost perfectly along the collapse scenario the MIT team laid out half a century ago. We are by the numbers exactly where they feared we would be, and this imminent collapse, the researchers stressed, would not necessarily mean the extinction of the human race. It would instead be a societal turning point, a great unwinding that would see standards of living free-falling around the world for decades. The decline of civilization as we know it, they wrote, would include dramatic disruptions to trade routes, violent shifts in supply and demand, the return of disease, the degradation of the environment, and extreme political dysfunction. In such an apocalyptic scenario, you can see that the basic needs of society are not being met or simply cannot be accomplished anymore. Losing food security, losing basic security. Archaeologists who study the fall of past civilizations agree, these are the universal ways we measure collapse. And everything we are seeing right now suggests it is not a question of if these events will arrive, but when and how fast. History has taught us a brutal lesson again and again: civilizations do not last forever. The Romans believed they were eternal. So did the Maya, the Sumerians, the Khmer, and a dozen other great powers that are now nothing more than ruins and footnotes. Every single one of them thought they were too big, too advanced, too important to fall, and every single one of them was wrong. The difference today is that for the first time in history, our crisis is not local, it is planetary. There is no neighboring empire to flee to, no untouched frontier to start over in. When this system breaks, it breaks for everyone, everywhere, all at once. The only real question is how quickly these events could become so drastic that they spark an irreversible shift in society. And the honest answer, based on the data pouring in, is quicker than almost anyone wants to admit. In today's video, we have compiled the most alarming signs that the collapse of society has not just begun, it is speeding up. The downfall of our major institutions, our economies, our ecosystems, and our infrastructure is gaining momentum with each passing year, and the curve is bending in the wrong direction. But before we get into this list, please support us by leaving a thumbs up on this video and subscribing to our channel so you don't miss our future lists, because the stories we are about to cover are only going to become more important in the months ahead. Without further ado, here are 20 signs that the collapse of society is accelerating. Number 1. When researchers updated the original Limits to Growth study using real, observed data, they did not look at a single number. They tracked 10 different variables together: population, fertility rates, mortality, pollution levels, food production per capita, industrial output, services, and the depletion of non-renewable resources, and they compared the real-world trajectory of all of them against the model from 1972. The result was not reassuring. Our actual path lines up extremely closely with the business-as-usual collapse scenario, the very pathway the MIT team warned would lead to a halt in growth and a decline in human welfare within the first half of this century. This is not a fringe prediction anymore. It is a pattern that has been quietly confirming itself for 50 years, and we are now living inside the window where the model expected the curves to bend. Industrial output and food per person were projected to plateau and then fall, and across large parts of the world, that is exactly what we are beginning to see. The most disturbing part is not that one report got something right. It is that we were handed the warning 2 full generations ago. We had every chance to change course, and instead we pressed the accelerator. The trajectory we are on was never inevitable. It was chosen, decision by decision, quarter by quarter, in the endless pursuit of more. And what makes this finding so unsettling is the credibility of its source. This was not a doomsday cult or a fringe blogger making wild predictions. This was the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, one of the most respected scientific institutions on the planet, using the most advanced computer modeling of its era, working on a study commissioned by an international think tank of scientists, economists, and industrialists. Their critics laughed at them for decades, insisting that human ingenuity and free markets would always find a way to outrun scarcity. Yet here we are, with the empirical data tracking their most pessimistic mainstream scenario point by point. Industrial output per capita, which the model said would peak in the early decades of this century before declining, is now showing exactly that kind of strain in advanced economies. Pollution, in the form of greenhouse gases, has accumulated precisely as projected. Resource extraction has grown more difficult and more expensive, just as the model predicted it would. When a 50-year-old forecast keeps coming true with this kind of accuracy, the rational response is not comfort, it is alarm. Because the same model that nailed the first half of the story also tells us what is supposed to come next, and what comes next is the part nobody wants to read. Number 2. The study also showed something deceptively simple but devastating in its implications. A civilization that depends on ever-increasing quantities of raw materials eventually runs into a wall, a point where the resources simply cannot be pulled out of the ground fast enough or cheaply enough to keep the machine running. And once that happens, economic growth does not slow gently. It cracks. Today, the entire world is being squeezed by exactly this kind of pressure. Demand for the essential materials that underpin modern life, the metals, minerals, fuels, and rare elements inside everything from your phone to a power grid, keeps climbing relentlessly. But the planet's ability to supply them is straining. The easy deposits have already been mined, and what remains is deeper, dirtier, and more expensive to extract. The world's appetite for critical minerals like lithium, cobalt, copper, and nickel has exploded as nations race to electrify and rearm at the same time, and the gap between what we want and what we can actually produce keeps widening. We have built a civilization that assumes the shelves will always be restocked. The uncomfortable truth is that the warehouse is finite. The cheap and accessible portion of it is already being emptied, and there is no second planet waiting in reserve. Consider what it actually takes to keep modern life running. A single electric vehicle battery requires tens of kilograms of lithium, cobalt, nickel, and manganese, much of it mined in just a handful of countries under conditions that range from environmentally devastating to outright exploitative. A wind turbine needs rare earth elements that are concentrated in a tiny number of deposits worldwide. The semiconductors inside every computer, phone, car, and weapon system depend on a fragile global supply chain that a single disruption can paralyze. As nations race simultaneously to electrify their economies and to rearm their militaries, they are competing for the same finite pool of materials, and that competition is driving prices up, straining supplies, and turning resource access into a flashpoint for geopolitical conflict. The era of cheap, abundant raw materials that fueled the great expansion of the 20th century is ending, and what replaces it is a world of scarcity, hoarding, and competition. When the inputs that the entire economy depends on become harder and more expensive to obtain, growth does not simply slow. It begins to consume itself, and the machine that everyone assumed would run forever starts to grind against its own limits. Number 3. On top of the raw materials crunch, the institutions that monitor the global economy are flashing warning lights that are impossible to ignore. The International Monetary Fund, in its most recent World Economic Outlook, downgraded its forecast for global growth, projecting the world economy to expand by just 3.1% this year, a downward revision driven directly by the outbreak of war in the Middle East, surging commodity prices, firmer inflation, and tighter financial conditions. The IMF titled its own analysis around a single grim theme: a global economy operating in the shadow of war. Manufacturing is being throttled by a shortage of materials, by unreliable energy supplies, and by the mounting costs of a destabilized climate. For developing economies, the picture is even darker. The fund slashed its outlook for the Middle East and Central Asia by a full 2 percentage points, down to under 2%, as the regional conflict gutted confidence and froze investment. Growth is not just slowing, it is fragmenting, splitting the world into zones of relative stability and zones of accelerating decline, and the line between the two is shifting in the wrong direction. When the people whose entire job is to project optimism start writing about war, stagflation, and recession risk in the same paragraph, it is time to listen. And the IMF was careful to spell out the downside risks lurking just beneath its already gloomy baseline. A longer or wider war in the Middle East, a deeper fragmentation of the global economy into rival blocs, a sudden reassessment of the productivity miracle that markets have been counting on from artificial intelligence, or a fresh outbreak of trade tensions. Any one of these, the fund warned, could significantly weaken growth and destabilize financial markets. In other words, the official forecast is not the worst case. It is the hopeful case, the one that assumes nothing else goes wrong, and in a world where everything seems to be going wrong at once, that assumption looks increasingly naive. The global growth rate has been quietly grinding lower for years, decade after decade, in a long deceleration that economists have struggled to explain and politicians have refused to confront. We have grown so accustomed to the promise of perpetual expansion that we have built our entire financial system, our pensions, our debts, and our social contracts on the assumption that the economy will always be bigger next year than it was this year. When that assumption finally breaks, and the data suggests it is breaking, the consequences will reach into every household on the planet. Number 4. The imbalance between how fast humanity is growing and how fast we can feed ourselves keeps getting wider, and that gap sits at the very heart of every collapse scenario ever modeled. The global population has now pushed past 8 billion people, and even though the rate of growth has slowed, we are still adding tens of millions of mouths to feed every single year. To keep pace, agricultural experts have long warned that the world would need to increase food production by roughly 70% over current levels in the coming decades, just to meet projected demand. But that target assumed stable weather, cheap energy, healthy soils, and peaceful trade routes, and every one of those assumptions is now in question. Fertilizer prices have swung violently with the energy crisis, croplands are exhausting, water is running short, and the wars disrupting global grain and fertilizer exports are pulling the rug out from under the entire calculation. We are being asked to grow far more food than ever before at the exact moment that the conditions for growing food are deteriorating in nearly every direction at once. That is not a recipe for abundance. It is the precise mismatch the collapse models warned would eventually break the system, and it is worth pausing to understand just how delicately balanced the modern food system really is. The world does not keep large reserves of food. At any given moment, the planet has only a few months of grain stored in its silos and warehouses, a thin buffer against disaster that we have allowed to shrink in the name of efficiency. Modern industrial agriculture is also extraordinarily dependent on inputs that come from far away: synthetic fertilizers made from natural gas, pesticides derived from petroleum, seeds engineered by a handful of corporations, and machinery that runs on diesel. A disruption to any one of those links, a spike in gas prices, a broken supply chain, a war in a fertilizer exporting region, sends shockwaves through the entire system. We have traded resilience for productivity, building a food system that produces astonishing yields under ideal conditions, but that is brittle and vulnerable the moment those conditions falter. For most of human history, communities grew much of their own food locally and kept reserves against lean years. We have dismantled that resilience and replaced it with a globe-spanning, just-in-time machine that works beautifully right up until the moment it doesn't. And the warning lights on that machine are now flashing red. Number 5, and the warning signs in the fields are no longer theoretical. They are showing up in hard data and in empty stomachs. Food production has stagnated or declined across dozens of vulnerable countries, and the consequences are catastrophic. The conflicts tearing through major grain-producing regions have repeatedly threatened the global food supply, choking off exports of wheat, sunflower oil, and fertilizer that billions of people quietly depend on. When a war disrupts a breadbasket, the price of bread rises in countries thousands of miles away, in markets that had nothing to do with the fighting. This is the brutal interconnectedness of the modern food system. A single shock in one region ripples outward and lands hardest on the poorest people on the planet, the ones with no savings, no buffer, and no alternative. The most chilling development of all is that famine, a word the modern world had convinced itself was a relic of the past, has come roaring back, For the first time since global food crisis monitoring began, two separate famines were confirmed in a single year, in Gaza and in parts of Sudan. Two simultaneous famines declared by the world's own monitoring bodies in an era of supposed plenty. If that does not register as a sign of a system breaking down, it is hard to imagine what the return of famine actually means. For most of the past several decades, the developed world operated on the comfortable assumption that mass starvation was a solved problem, a horror confined to history books and to the most extreme and isolated humanitarian emergencies. We told ourselves that with modern agriculture, global trade, and international aid, no one in the 21st century should ever have to starve to death. That assumption is now collapsing in real time. Famine has been formally declared by the world's own rigorous monitoring systems, in more than one place at once, not because the world cannot grow enough food, but because war, blockades, economic collapse, and political dysfunction have made that food impossible to deliver to the people who need it. That is the cruelest detail of all. These are not famines of absolute scarcity. They are famines of broken systems, of supply chains severed by conflict, of aid blocked by politics, of money that has lost its value, of governance that has failed. And a famine caused by a broken system is far more frightening than one caused by a bad harvest, because it tells us the system itself is what is broken, and systems that break in one place have a way of breaking in others. Number 6. The ground beneath the food system is literally giving out. Over the last 2 decades, a vast share of the Earth's vegetated surface has become measurably less productive, the soils thinning, the land degrading, the capacity to grow food quietly eroding year after year. Roughly a fifth of the planet's vegetated land is now in decline, and that rate is poised to climb as humanity's failure to protect biodiversity, to conserve water, and to manage land sustainably catches up with us. Salinization alone has degraded tens of millions of hectares of cropland, poisoning fields in some of the world's most important breadbaskets, while erosion, drought, and overuse strip away the topsoil that took thousands of years to form. Soil is not a renewable resource on any human timescale. Once it is gone, it is effectively gone for generations. We are treating the thin living skin of the planet, the layer that everything we eat ultimately depends on, as if it were limitless and indestructible. It is neither. And as that productive land shrinks, the same growing population is being asked to survive on a diminishing foundation. The math does not work, and the planet is beginning to show us the bill. Soil degradation is one of those slow-moving catastrophes that almost never makes the headlines, precisely because it unfolds across years and decades rather than hours and days. There is no single dramatic image of dying soil the way there is of a flood or a fire. Instead, there is just a quiet, relentless decline. Fields that yield a little less each season, land that holds a little less water, ground that needs a little more fertilizer to produce the same harvest, until one day a region that once fed itself can no longer do so. The United Nations has estimated that the world loses an area of fertile soil the size of a small country every single year to erosion, salinization, desertification, and overuse. At the same time, the relentless pumping of groundwater to irrigate crops in dry regions is draining ancient aquifers that took millennia to fill and that will not refill in any human lifetime. We are quite literally mining the foundations of our own food supply, treating the irreplaceable as if it were infinite. And the cruelest part is that the damage is largely invisible until it is too late to reverse. By the time a breadbasket fails, the soil that sustained it has usually been degrading for decades, ignored by everyone too busy chasing this season's yield to notice the ground giving way beneath their feet. Number 7. The number of people facing acute food insecurity, meaning they cannot reliably get enough to eat to live a healthy life, has climbed relentlessly higher, year after year, crisis after crisis. According to the Global Report on Food Crises, the joint effort of United Nations agencies and partners, hundreds of millions of people are now trapped in high levels of acute food insecurity, with the most recent assessments counting more than 295 million people across dozens of countries living in crisis conditions or worse. That number has risen for several consecutive years, a grimly consistent upward march that no amount of aid has been able to reverse. Behind every one of those figures is a human being making impossible choices. A parent skipping meals so their children can eat, families selling their last possessions, communities walking for days in search of food that may not be there when they arrive. The scale of the challenge keeps expanding, tens of millions of additional people slipping into hunger with each new round of conflict, drought, and economic shock. We are not bending the curve of hunger downward. We are watching it climb, and the climb itself is one of the clearest measures we have that the system meant to feed humanity is failing more people every single year. What makes this trend so ominous is its consistency. This is not a single bad year caused by one unusual disaster. It is a sustained, multi-year escalation, a staircase that keeps climbing regardless of how much aid is poured into the problem. The drivers are stacking on top of one another, conflict displacing farmers and destroying harvests, climate shocks wiping out crops, economic crises making food unaffordable, even where it is available, and the aftershocks of a global pandemic that disrupted everything from labor to logistics. And these drivers do not act alone, they compound. A drought weakens a region, then a conflict pushes it over the edge, then an economic crisis ensures it cannot recover. Humanitarian organizations, the very institutions meant to be the safety net of last resort, are now warning that they are overwhelmed, that funding is not keeping pace with need, and that they are being forced into the unbearable position of cutting rations to the starving in order to feed the dying. When the global safety net itself begins to fray, when there are simply too many emergencies and not enough resources to meet them, the rising tide of hunger stops being a series of separate crises and becomes a single planetary condition. And that condition is worsening, year after year, in front of our eyes. Number 8. At the very sharpest edge of this crisis are the people facing emergency and catastrophic levels of hunger, the conditions just one step away from outright famine and starvation. Tens of millions of people are now living in emergency-level hunger, and most alarmingly, the number of people facing the highest, catastrophic phase of food insecurity, the level where starvation, death, and destitution are evident, has surged past 1 million. And stayed there. These are not people who are merely hungry. These are people whose bodies are shutting down, whose children are dying of malnutrition, who have exhausted every coping strategy a human family has. Each night, hundreds of millions of people around the world go to bed without enough to eat, and a portion of them wake up to a day with no realistic prospect of finding food. The famines that have been formally declared in recent months are the visible tip of this catastrophe, but beneath them sits a vast, growing population teetering on the same edge. When catastrophic hunger stops being a rare emergency and becomes a permanent fixture of the global landscape, present every single year in multiple countries at once, that is not a humanitarian blip. That is the texture of a civilization beginning to come apart at its weakest seams. And we must be honest about what catastrophic hunger does to a society, because it is never just a nutritional emergency. Starvation is one of the most powerful engines of instability humanity has ever known. When people cannot feed their children, they will do anything. Walk hundreds of miles, cross deadly borders, take up arms, or follow anyone who promises them a meal. Mass hunger empties the countryside and floods the cities. It fuels migration on a scale that overwhelms neighboring nations. It hands recruiters for armed groups and extremist movements a steady supply of desperate young people with nothing left to lose. History is unambiguous on this point. Some of the most violent upheavals of the modern era, revolutions, civil wars, and the collapse of governments, were preceded by sharp spikes in the price of bread and the spread of hunger. A well-fed population may tolerate a great deal of injustice, but a starving one will not tolerate anything for long. So when we see catastrophic hunger spreading and entrenching itself across multiple regions at once, we are not just witnessing a humanitarian tragedy, devastating as that is. We are watching the accumulation of social and political pressure that throughout history has repeatedly torn societies apart. The hunger is the symptom. The instability it breeds is the disease that spreads. Number 9. The world is in the grip of one of the most severe energy crises in modern history, a shock comparable to and in some ways worse than the oil crises of the 1970s. The fragile balance of the global energy system, already strained by years of underinvestment and volatile demand, has been blown wide open. In early 2026, escalation in the Middle East triggered what analysts have called the largest oil supply disruption in history, cutting roughly 10 million barrels per day from global markets almost overnight. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which around a fifth of all the world's traded oil must pass, was effectively choked off. Brent crude, which had been hovering in the 70s, rocketed past $120 a barrel, and by the end of that month had recorded its largest single-month price increase ever measured. Energy is not just one commodity among many. It is the master resource, the thing that powers the production of food, the pumping of water, the running of hospitals, the movement of goods, and the heating of homes. When the price of energy spikes, the price of everything spikes. A civilization that runs on cheap, abundant, reliable energy does not handle expensive, scarce, unreliable energy gracefully. It seizes up, and right now that seizure is spreading across the globe. To grasp how dangerous this is, you have to understand just how completely the modern world depends on a handful of narrow geographic choke points through which the lifeblood of civilization flows. The Strait of Hormuz is the most important of them all, a passage barely 20 miles wide at its narrowest, through which an enormous share of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas must travel. There is no easy alternative route for most of it. When that single waterway is closed, there is no switch to flip. No backup pipeline that can absorb the lost volume, no strategic reserve large enough to cover the shortfall for long. The world simply does without, and the price of what remains explodes. This is the hidden fragility at the heart of our energy system, a global economy of 8 billion people balanced on a few narrow straits, a handful of pipelines, and a small number of producing regions, any of which can be disrupted by war, sabotage, or accident. We built this system during an age of relative peace and cheap oil, and we assumed that age would last forever. It has not. As geopolitical conflict returns with a vengeance, the very arteries that carry energy to the world have become targets, and every disruption sends the cost of modern life surging higher. An energy shock of this magnitude does not stay contained in the energy sector. It bleeds into food, into manufacturing, into transport, into everything, and it pushes already strained economies toward the breaking point. Number 10. The cost of our addiction to fossil fuels is not measured only in dollars at the pump. It is measured in human lives on a scale that dwarfs almost every other threat we worry about. Air pollution, driven largely by the burning of oil, gas, and coal, is the single largest environmental risk to human health on the planet, and it carries a staggering price tag, costing the global economy trillions of dollars every year in lost lives, lost productivity, and medical care, an amount equal to a significant share of global GDP. But the truly horrifying number is the body count. Air pollution is responsible for the deaths of around 7 million people every single year. Let that sink in. Roughly 1 in every 10 deaths worldwide can be traced back to the air we breathe, poisoned by the same energy system that powers our economies. These are not distant casualties of some future disaster. They are happening right now, quietly, in cities and villages all over the world. A slow-motion catastrophe so constant that we have learned to tune it out. The fuel that built the modern world is also steadily killing the people who live in it. And as energy systems strain and the cheapest, dirtiest fuels get pushed back into service, that toll threatens to climb even higher. And this is one of the cruelest feedback loops in the entire collapse scenario. When energy prices spike and supplies tighten, as they are doing right now, governments and industries do not respond by burning less. They respond by burning whatever is cheapest and most available, which often means reaching back for the dirtiest fuels of all. Coal and heavy oil, the very sources that pump the most poison into the air and the most carbon into the atmosphere. A crisis of energy scarcity, in other words, tends to make both air pollution and climate change worse, not better, accelerating the very damage that is helping to destabilize the world in the first place. The 7 million annual deaths from air pollution are already a silent pandemic, one that kills more people every few years than all the wars of the past century combined, and yet it generates almost no headlines because it is so constant and so diffuse. There are no dramatic explosions, just children developing asthma, adults dying years early from heart and lung disease, and entire cities choking under a haze that has become so normal that people forget the sky was ever clear. As the world burns dirtier fuel to survive its energy crisis, that invisible death toll will climb, a quiet measure of a civilization poisoning itself in the act of trying to keep the lights on. Number 11. The energy crisis is not confined to one region or one fuel. It is rippling outward across the entire planet, hitting industrialized and developing nations alike. Europe and Asia have borne some of the most acute shocks, with skyrocketing electricity and gas prices forcing factories to shut down, governments to ration power, and households to choose between heating and eating. But the effects are global. Energy shortages, blackouts, fuel queues, and price spikes have been reported across a long list of countries on nearly every continent, from the major industrial powers to the most fragile economies. With the Strait of Hormuz disrupted and global oil flows in turmoil, gasoline prices have surged, in some markets jumping by more than $1 a gallon in a matter of weeks, with warnings of far higher prices to come if the crisis is not resolved. When energy becomes unaffordable, the consequences cascade in every direction at once. Industries contract, workers are laid off, food becomes more expensive to grow, process, and transport. Water becomes more expensive to pump and purify. And social unrest, the kind that has toppled governments throughout history, begins to simmer. An energy crisis is never just an energy crisis. It is the first domino in a chain that runs straight through the heart of civilization. We have already seen how quickly this chain can run. When energy prices surged in the early years of this decade, the effects showed up almost immediately in places that seemed to have nothing to do with oil and gas. Fertilizer plants, which depend on natural gas, shut down, driving up the cost of growing food. Energy-intensive industries like steel, glass, aluminum, and chemicals throttled back production, sending ripples through every supply chain that depends on those basic materials, which is to say nearly all of them. Households across the wealthy world were stunned by heating and electricity bills that doubled or tripled, forcing governments to spend enormous sums shielding their populations from the worst of it, money that had to be borrowed, adding to the mountains of debt we will return to later in this video. And in the poorest countries, where there was no government cushion, the result was simply darkness, factories that could not run, hospitals that could not power their equipment, and families that could not cook. The latest energy shock, born of war in the Middle East and the strangling of the world's most important oil choke point, threatens to be even more severe and more prolonged. And because everything in the modern economy ultimately runs on energy, an energy crisis of this scale is not one problem among many. It is the problem that makes every other problem worse. Number 12. While we fight over energy and food in the present, the climate is quietly rewriting the conditions of human survival for the future, and the bill for decades of inaction is now coming due. The World Bank has warned that climate change could push an additional 100 million people into extreme poverty within this decade alone, wiping out hard-won development gains and dragging the most vulnerable communities backward. Climate change does not announce itself with a single dramatic event. It works through 1,000 smaller blows: a failed harvest here, a flooded village there, a heat wave that kills the elderly, a drought that empties a reservoir, a storm that destroys a year of savings in an afternoon. Each blow lands hardest on the people least able to absorb it: the subsistence farmers, the urban poor, the families already living one bad season away from disaster. As the climate destabilizes, the thin margin that separates poverty from catastrophe disappears for hundreds of millions of people. This is how a warming planet translates into a collapsing society, not through a single apocalyptic moment, but through the relentless erosion of the conditions that allow ordinary people to survive and plan for the future. And that erosion is accelerating. What the World Bank's warning captures is the way climate change acts as a threat multiplier, taking every existing weakness in a society and making it worse. A region already struggling with poverty becomes destitute when its harvests fail. A nation already strained by political tension boils over when drought and food prices push its people past their limit. A community already living on the margins is wiped out by a single flood or storm. Climate change rarely creates problems entirely from scratch. Instead, it amplifies the ones that are already there, pouring fuel on fires that were already smoldering. And the people who did the least to cause the crisis are, with bitter irony, the ones who suffer most from it. The wealthy nations that built their prosperity by burning fossil fuels for over a century have the resources to adapt, to build seawalls, to subsidize farmers, to air-condition their cities. The poor nations that contributed almost nothing to the problem have none of those defenses. They are simply exposed, left to absorb blow after blow with no shelter. This is the deep injustice at the core of the climate crisis, and it is also a recipe for rage, resentment, and instability that will reverberate across borders, because suffering on this scale does not stay quietly contained where it begins. Number 13. The raw numbers on global temperature have crossed a line that scientists spent decades warning us to avoid. Recent years have shattered record after record, and the planet recently logged its hottest year in the entire instrumental record, with the global average temperature climbing to roughly 1.55 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. The first time a full calendar year has breached the critical 1.5-degree threshold that the world's nations had pledged to defend. Every one of the warmest years ever measured has now occurred within the last decade, an unbroken streak of heat that leaves no room for doubt about the direction we are headed. And the consequences of that warming are not abstract. For every additional degree Celsius the planet heats up, scientists project meaningful declines in the yields of staple crops like wheat and rice, the very foods that feed the bulk of humanity. A hotter world is a hungrier world. The oceans are warming, the ice is melting, the weather is growing more violent and less predictable, and the comfortable climate that allowed human agriculture and civilization to flourish over the last 10,000 years is slipping away. We have spent that stability like an inheritance we assumed would never run out. The bill is now coming due, and the balance is overdue. It is worth dwelling on just how unprecedented these temperature records are, because the human mind struggles to process slow, planetary change. The last decade contains every single one of the 10 hottest years ever reliably measured. That is not a coincidence or a statistical fluke. It is a signal as clear as any in the history of science, the unmistakable signature of a planet warming rapidly under the weight of human activity. And crossing the 1.5-degree threshold, even for a single year, matters enormously, because that was the line the world's scientists identified as the boundary beyond which the risks of catastrophic self-reinforcing climate change rise sharply. Beyond that line lie the tipping points that climate scientists fear most: the melting of the great ice sheets, the thawing of the permafrost that would release vast stores of trapped carbon, the dieback of the rainforests that act as the planet's lungs, the disruption of ocean currents that regulate the climate of entire continents. These are not gradual, reversible changes. They are thresholds that, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed on any time scale that matters to human civilization. We are now playing a game of chance with the only habitable planet we have, and every year of record heat tilts the odds further against us. The stable climate that allowed humanity to invent agriculture, build cities, and create civilization is not guaranteed to continue, and we are actively dismantling it. Number 14. Across vast regions of the world, drought has tightened its grip to a degree not seen in centuries. In the United States, enormous swaths of the country have repeatedly fallen into drought conditions, with the parched lands of the American Southwest hit hardest of all. Studies of tree rings and soil moisture have revealed something genuinely shocking: that the multi-decade mega-drought afflicting the Southwest is the most severe such event in at least 1,200 years, the driest stretch since long before the founding of any modern nation. Temperatures across these regions have run well above the historical norm, baking the soil, shrinking the reservoirs, and pushing ancient rivers toward record lows. And this is not a uniquely American problem. From the Mediterranean to the Horn of Africa, from South America to South Asia, prolonged and intensifying droughts have devastated agriculture, drained water supplies, and driven millions of people from their land. The years just behind us have witnessed some of the most widespread and damaging droughts in recorded history, with the economic toll now running into the hundreds of billions of dollars every year, more than the entire annual output of most countries on Earth. Water, the one resource no living thing can do without, is becoming scarce in the very places that grow our food. And drought is a uniquely insidious disaster, because unlike a flood or an earthquake, it has no clear beginning and no clear end. It creeps in slowly, season by season, until one day a region realizes that its reservoirs are empty, its rivers are trickles, and its wells have run dry. By then the damage is already done, the crops already failed, the livestock already dead, the communities already on the move. A mega-drought, a drought lasting decades, is something almost no living human has experienced before. Yet that is precisely what the science tells us is unfolding across the American Southwest and other regions, a drought so prolonged and so severe that it has no parallel in more than 1,000 years. The great rivers that built the modern West, that water its farms and supply its cities, have fallen to levels that were once unthinkable, forcing the first mandatory water cuts in their history, and raising the once unspeakable question of whether some of the fastest-growing regions of the developed world are running out of the most basic resource of all. And the same story is playing out around the globe, in southern Europe, in the Horn of Africa, in the great agricultural heartlands of Asia and South America. When water fails in the places that feed the world, the consequences do not respect borders. They arrive eventually on every plate. Number 15. The drought crisis is only going to deepen, and the projections are sobering. A growing body of research warns that because of intensifying droughts and the relentless overdraft of underground water, agricultural water scarcity is expected to spread across the overwhelming majority of the world's croplands within the coming decades. The United Nations has gone so far as to declare that the world has entered a new era of water crisis, with scientists describing a state of global water bankruptcy, a point at which humanity is drawing down its water reserves faster than nature can ever replenish them. Already more than 170 million hectares of irrigated cropland, an area larger than several major European nations combined, sit under high or very high water stress. Roughly 3 billion people, and more than half of all global food production, are concentrated in regions where total water storage is already declining or unstable. We are, in effect, eating into the planet's water savings account to fund the present, leaving nothing for the future. And when the wells run dry in the places that feed the world, the consequences will not stay confined to those regions. They will arrive on every dinner table on Earth, in the form of higher prices, emptier shelves, and a food system stretched past its breaking point. The concept of water bankruptcy that UN scientists have now formally defined is a chilling one, because bankruptcy is what happens when you have spent not just your income but your savings and have nothing left to draw on. That is precisely the situation humanity is creating with its water. Across vast agricultural regions, farmers have kept production high, not by using rainfall, which is sustainable, but by pumping groundwater out of underground aquifers far faster than those aquifers can ever refill. It is the equivalent of a household maintaining its lifestyle by draining a savings account that took 10,000 years to fill. For a while, everything looks fine. The crops grow, the food flows, the cities expand. But the account is finite, and when it runs out, the reckoning is sudden and brutal. Entire farming regions that have come to depend on this borrowed water face the prospect of collapse within a single generation, as the wells run dry and there is nothing left underground to replace them. Renewable water available per person has been declining steadily for years as the population grows and the supply shrinks, and there is no substitute for water. No technology that can conjure it from nothing at the scale agriculture requires. When the water bankruptcy comes due, the regions that fed the world may find they can no longer feed themselves. Number 16. The same forces destabilizing our water and our climate are also making the planet a more dangerous place to simply live. The vast majority of the world's land-based ecosystems are now threatened by increasingly extreme weather, and the events that flow from a destabilized climate, the wildfires, the floods, the megastorms, and the droughts, are growing more frequent, more intense, and more destructive with each passing year. The forecasts are staggering. Climate-driven disasters could displace hundreds of millions of people in the coming decades, forcing entire communities to abandon homes, farms, and cities that have become unlivable. We are already seeing the beginnings of this great uprooting. In the towns burned to the ground by fires that move faster than people can flee, in the coastal communities swallowed by rising seas and surging storms, in the farming regions abandoned because the rains no longer come when they should. Mass displacement on this scale is not just a humanitarian tragedy. It is a profound source of instability, straining the resources of receiving regions, igniting competition and conflict, and overwhelming the capacity of governments to cope. A world on the move is a world under strain, and the climate is steadily setting more and more of humanity in motion with nowhere safe to go. And here we should pause to recognize a number that on its own captures the scale of the upheaval already underway. Even before the full force of climate displacement arrives, the world is already experiencing the highest levels of forced displacement in recorded history, with well over 100 million people uprooted from their homes by war, persecution, and disaster. That is more than the entire population of most countries on Earth, a floating nation of the displaced, larger than it has ever been. And the experts are unanimous that climate change will pour fuel on this fire, adding tens or even hundreds of millions more to the ranks of the uprooted in the decades ahead. Mass migration on this scale tests the limits of every system meant to manage it. It strains the resources of host communities, inflames political tensions, fuels the rise of extremism and xenophobia, and overwhelms the humanitarian organizations meant to provide shelter and aid. We are already seeing how the movement of people across borders has become one of the most explosive and destabilizing issues in politics across the developed world. Now imagine that pressure multiplied many times over, as whole regions become too hot, too dry, too flooded, or too storm-battered to sustain human life. The great climate migration has barely begun, and it is already reshaping the politics of the planet. What comes next will test the fabric of global society as never before. Number 17. If you want a single measure of how unstable our world has become, look at the sheer number of conflicts now burning across the globe at the same time. By multiple independent counts, the number of armed conflicts worldwide has reached its highest level since the end of the Second World War, 8 decades ago. Researchers tracking global violence recorded dozens of active state-based conflicts in a single recent year, spread across dozens of countries, with the number of direct wars between individual states doubling from the year before, the most since records began in 1946. The human cost has been horrifying, with conflict fatalities climbing to their highest level in decades, hundreds of thousands of lives extinguished in a single year of fighting, from the war between Russia and Ukraine to clashes between India and Pakistan, to fighting along the borders of Afghanistan, to the eruption of open war in the Middle East drawing in Israel, Iran, and the United States, to the brutal conflicts grinding on in Sudan, Myanmar, Haiti, and beyond. The map of the world is lit up with violence on a scale this generation has never witnessed. When you survey the nearly 200 nations and territories on the planet, the overwhelming majority have experienced some form of armed conflict, civil unrest, riots, or violent instability in just the past year. A peaceful world is becoming the exception. A world at war is becoming the rule. And this is perhaps the single most alarming sign of all, because it marks the breakdown of the international order that kept the great powers from open conflict for the better part of 80 years. The doubling of direct wars between states in a single recent year, to the highest number since the Second World War, signals something that strategists have feared for decades: the return of great power confrontation, the kind of large-scale interstate war that the modern world had convinced itself was a thing of the past. The eruption of open war in the Middle East, drawing in major powers, the grinding continental war in Eastern Europe, the dangerous flashpoints between nuclear-armed rivals in South Asia, the proliferating conflicts across Africa and beyond, all of it points to a world where the guardrails are failing. The institutions built after the last World War to prevent the next one, the diplomatic forums, the treaties, the shared assumptions about restraint, are eroding, and nations are increasingly willing to settle their disputes with force. War does not merely kill the people caught in it, devastating as that is. It shatters supply chains, severs trade routes, diverts vast resources away from human needs and toward destruction, and poisons the cooperation between nations that every other crisis on this list demands. We face a planet of overlapping emergencies that can only be solved through unprecedented global cooperation at the exact moment that the world is fragmenting into armed and hostile camps. That is the worst possible combination, and it is the combination we have. Number 18. Beneath all the headlines about war and climate sits a foundational fact that should shape how we understand everything else. Most people on this planet are poor, and the cushion protecting them from disaster is dangerously thin. The vast majority of humanity lives on a tiny fraction of what people in wealthy nations take for granted, with billions surviving on just a few dollars a day. Even by the World Bank's own updated measure, around 800 million people remain trapped in extreme poverty, scraping by on less than $3 a day, with the largest concentrations in sub-Saharan Africa and in fragile, conflict-affected states. And for the first time in a generation, the long, slow march of progress against global poverty has stalled. The overlapping shocks of pandemic, climate disaster, food price spikes, and escalating conflict have eroded hard-won gains and, in many regions, reversed them outright. This matters enormously for the stability of the whole system, because poor populations have no buffer. A bad harvest, a price spike, a lost job, or a single illness can tip an entire family into catastrophe overnight. When billions of people are already living on the edge, even a modest shock to food, fuel, or income can ignite hunger, desperation, and unrest on a massive scale. A world this poor and this fragile is a world primed for collapse. It is easy, from the comfort of a wealthy nation, to lose sight of just how precarious life is for most of humanity. The majority of the world's people do not have savings to fall back on, do not have insurance, do not have governments capable of cushioning them from disaster. They live, in a very real sense, from one day to the next, their survival depending on the price of food staying affordable, the rains coming on time, the work being available, and nothing going catastrophically wrong. For these billions of people, there is no margin for error, no buffer between an ordinary life and a humanitarian emergency. This is what makes the current convergence of crises so dangerous. A shock that a rich society could absorb, a spike in food prices, a jump in fuel costs, a failed harvest, a lost job, is for the global poor a potential death sentence. And the recent reversal of decades of progress against poverty means that the ranks of the vulnerable are growing, not shrinking for the first time in a generation. When the cushion that protects the most fragile members of the human family wears thin, the whole structure becomes unstable, because desperation on a mass scale is the raw material from which unrest, migration, conflict, and collapse are made. We have built a global civilization in which the prosperity of the few rests on the precariousness of the many, and that is not a foundation that can hold under the weight of converging crises. Number 19. Now layer on top of that fragile foundation the relentless rise in the cost of living, and you have a recipe for a global crisis of survival. Across the planet, prices for the essentials, food, fuel, housing, and energy have been climbing faster than wages, devouring the purchasing power of ordinary people in rich and poor countries alike. Inflation, which the world's central banks spent years insisting was under control, has proven stubborn and corrosive, and the renewed energy shock from the Middle East war has sent it surging again, with global headline inflation projected to climb back toward the mid-single digits and to remain elevated. In advanced economies and developing nations alike, families that once felt secure are watching their grocery bills double, their rent become unpayable, and their savings evaporate. For the wealthy, inflation is an inconvenience. For the working poor, it is an existential threat. The difference between keeping the lights on and going dark, between feeding the children and going without. Throughout history, The moment when ordinary people can no longer afford bread has been the spark that lights the fuse of revolution and upheaval. We are now in a world where that moment is arriving simultaneously in dozens of countries, and the political consequences of so many people being pushed to the brink at once are only beginning to unfold. There is a particular cruelty to inflation that makes it uniquely corrosive to social stability. Unlike a recession, which throws some people out of work while leaving others untouched, inflation steals from everyone at once, quietly, relentlessly, every single day. It erodes savings that took a lifetime to accumulate. It punishes the prudent and the thrifty. It makes a mockery of fixed incomes and pensions. And it hits hardest on the essentials: food, fuel, and shelter, the things the poor spend most of their income on and cannot do without. When the price of bread, of rice, of cooking oil, of gasoline climbs faster than wages year after year, people do not experience it as an abstract economic statistic. They experience it as a slow, grinding loss of dignity, as the creeping realization that no matter how hard they work, they are falling behind. That feeling, multiplied across hundreds of millions of households in dozens of countries at once, is one of the most politically explosive forces in human history. It is no accident that periods of high inflation have so often been followed by political upheaval, by the rise of extremism, by the toppling of governments, and by social breakdown. We are living through exactly such a period now, a global cost of living crisis unfolding on every continent at once, and the anger it is generating has nowhere to go but into the political system, which is itself already under enormous strain. Number 20. Finally, the machine that is supposed to keep all of this running, the global economy itself, is slowing in a way that ties every other crisis together into a single, accelerating spiral. Major financial institutions have repeatedly cut their forecasts for global growth, warning of mounting downside risks and the rising danger of stagflation and recession, that toxic combination of stagnant growth and relentless inflation that strangles economies and impoverishes populations. And sitting beneath the entire global economy is a mountain of debt so vast it defies comprehension. Global debt has surged to a record high of around $348 trillion, an almost unimaginable sum that keeps climbing as governments, corporations, and households borrow ever more just to stay afloat. This is the ultimate expression of the limits to growth trap, a civilization sustaining the illusion of prosperity by borrowing from a future that may never be able to pay it back. When growth slows, debts that seemed manageable become crushing, and the whole leverage structure starts to wobble. Add to this the looming threat of new disease outbreaks, with health officials warning about the pandemic potential of viruses like H5N1 bird flu and tracking a long list of dangerous outbreaks around the world, and you have an economic and biological landscape primed for cascading failure. The economy, the debt, the climate, the conflicts, the hunger, and the disease are not separate problems. They are facets of a single system under enormous strain, and that system is bending faster than ever. On top of all the facts we have just laid out, the warning signs keep multiplying. Even as the world reels from war, hunger, and economic turmoil, the specter of disease hangs over everything, with experts cataloging outbreaks of dozens of dangerous pathogens around the globe and warning that the next pandemic is not a question of if, but when. Health officials have been especially alarmed by the spread of avian influenza, the H5N1 bird flu, which has been described as completely out of control in animal populations, and which scientists fear could mutate into a strain capable of sustained human transmission. We have already lived through one global pandemic this decade, and we have seen how quickly a single virus can bring the entire world to its knees, shutter economies, sever supply chains, and expose just how fragile our interconnected systems really are. The idea that we are now navigating war, famine, climate breakdown, economic crisis, and pandemic threat all at the same time would have sounded like apocalyptic fiction not long ago. Today it is simply the news. Ladies and gentlemen, as the societal apocalypse approaches, the pattern of who suffers is depressingly familiar. The poorest will be hit the hardest, as they always have been, while the wealthiest may be insulated, at least for a time, behind their money and their walls. But make no mistake, no one is truly immune. As these events develop and feed on one another, the pain will move rapidly up the global economic chain, from the destitute to the working class to the comfortable middle and beyond. We will see a catastrophic surge in political turbulence, in humanitarian crises, in instability and great power rivalry across a hungry, exhausted, and increasingly desperate world. The challenges ahead are not exaggerations or doom-mongering for clicks. They are written plainly in the data, in the temperature records, in the conflict maps, in the hunger statistics, in the debt ledgers, and in the warnings of the very institutions whose job is to keep this system running. Every one of the numbers we have shared in this video is real, and together they tell a story of a civilization whose foundations are cracking faster than we are repairing them. The MIT researchers who sounded the alarm half a century ago did not believe collapse was inevitable. They believed we had a choice, that with enough foresight, enough cooperation, and enough willingness to abandon the dogma of infinite growth, humanity could still steer toward a stable and survivable future. That choice still exists, but the window is narrowing with every passing year. The question is no longer whether the warnings were correct. The data has answered that. The question is whether we will finally listen before the curve bends all the way down, or whether we will keep accelerating toward the wall, convinced, like every fallen civilization before us, that the rules of history somehow do not apply to us. We hope you found this video informative, even if it was difficult to watch. These are not easy truths, but they are truths we believe everyone deserves to understand, because awareness is the first step toward any kind of change. If this video made you think, please share this link with your family and friends, and let us know in the comments below what you believe we should be doing right now to pull back from the edge. We read every comment, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts. Stay informed, stay prepared, and we will see you in the next one.